For 500 years, Hollywood has fed us a comfortable, sugar-coated lie, a pale, dramatic aristocrat wrapping himself in a silk cape, scared to death of a little garlic and some wooden stakes. But let me tell you the truth, that birthed that myth is infinitely more disturbing than any movie script. The real man behind the Dracula legend didn't need plastic fangs or special effects. He took human suffering and transformed it into a political language so visceral, so absolutely brutal, that the largest, most terrifying military machine on the face of the earth literally turned around and marched home in fear. His name was Vlad III of Wallachia, but you might know him better by the legacy he left behind. To his allies, he was the only steel wall standing between Christian Europe and total domination by the Ottoman Empire, a lone figure holding back the tide of history. But to his enemies, he was something they didn't even have a vocabulary for yet. He was a prince who engineered horror the way a master architect designs a cathedral with mathematical precision with a dark, divine purpose. And always with a specific audience in mind. And here is the part they usually leave out of the history books because it's too heavy to handle. The most devastating weapon in his arsenal wasn't his army. It involved the women of the Ottoman Empire. Wives, daughters, mothers snatched up in raids and turned into a spectacle so vile, so psychologically shattering that it was designed to break the spirit of an entire civilization before a single sword was even swung. We are going to walk through every single bloody step of this timeline. We're going back to the years Vlad spent as a young boy, locked inside the gilded cage of the Sultan's palace, downloading the exact fears and insecurities of the empire he would one day burn to the ground. We'll walk the bloody path that put him on a throne nobody thought he could hold. We will take you all the way to that nightmare scenario when thousands of Ottoman scouts came over a hill and saw an entire valley transformed into a forest of impaled human bodies, thousands of them, including women stretching all the way to the horizon under the flickering torchlight. By the time we're done here, you're going to have to make a hard choice. Was Vlad the last desperate hope of a dying nation, or was he a monster that history should have buried and never forgiven? Before we dive into the deep end, I want to know who I'm talking to. Drop a comment below and tell me what city and country you're watching from right now. And if you're here because you want the raw, unfiltered truth that the mainstream skips over, make sure you join the movement. The year was 1442. And for an 11-year-old boy, everything he thought he knew about loyalty, family, and the world collapsed in the span of a single afternoon. Vlad was born the heir to the throne of Wallachia, destined for power. But he didn't lose his future to a plague or a battlefield defeat. No, he lost it to a handshake, a backroom deal made by the one person supposed to protect him. His own father surrendered him and his younger brother Radu to Sultan Murad II. They were handed over as human collateral, breathing guarantees that the father would stay loyal. They weren't exchange students, they were currency. Flesh and blood proof that Wallachia wouldn't dare step out of line. Imagine that for a second. Raised on stories of how cruel the Ottomans were, and then your own father hands you over to them. The betrayal was absolute. One minute he's a prince, the next he's a pawn. Suddenly he's a captive walking through palace corridors that echo with the language of his enemy. The entire atmosphere shifted. The prayers sounded different. The customs were alien. The world had flipped upside down. Every face watching him belonged to the very people his family had warned him about since he was in the cradle. But the physical danger wasn't the worst part. The deepest wound was the realization that his father had weighed his sons against his political power and chose the power. The place that forged him into a weapon was an Ottoman citadel far removed from anything familiar. This was a fortress where authority wasn't just administrative, it was theatrical. Power here was a performance art. Inside those walls, Vlad and his brother Radu were raised right alongside the Sultan's own son Mehmed, the future conqueror who would one day tear down the walls of Constantinople. They were playing with the kids who would grow up to destroy their world. On the surface, it looked like a privilege, a royal education, but underneath it was a leash, a golden cage. If their father ever broke his word, his sons' heads would be the first things to roll. The brothers got an education that most European nobles couldn't even fathom. We're talking philosophy, astronomy, multiple languages, theology, the fine art of calligraphy. They were trained to ride like warriors and think like generals. But the lessons that really stuck, the ones that rewired Vlad's brain, didn't come from a textbook. They came from what he saw with his own eyes when someone was foolish enough to challenge the empire holding him prisoner. He watched closely how the Ottomans handled dissent within their own elite janissary corps. He saw exactly what happened to towns that decided they didn't want to pay their taxes or tribute. He watched officers get broken not in secret dungeons but out in the open courtyards. Every scream was a lesson. Every drop of blood was a syllable in a message. Inside that empire, fear was never an accident, it was a strategy. It was psychological architecture. When a settlement defied the Sultan, they didn't just conquer it, they unmade it. They destroyed it in a way that would echo across every province for 1,000 miles. The aftermath was always left on display. Bodies arranged like grim statues where the trade caravans had to pass. Ruins left smoking as permanent monuments to disobedience. Vlad was downloading all of it, the choreography of the execution, the placement of the remains. He learned that a single act of extreme violence, if you staged it correctly, could govern a massive territory without you ever having to lift a finger again. It was savagery dressed up as high-level statecraft. Now, his brother Radu. He coped by surrendering. He drank the Kool-Aid. He embraced Islam, adopted the customs, and became the darling of the Ottoman court. The silk robes, the hypnotic music, the intellectual debates, Radu loved it. He thrived in it. But Vlad went the other way. Every year inside those walls, he got quieter, colder, and more observant. He didn't assimilate, he calculated. He studied that empire the way a wolf in a cage studies the latch. He memorized every routine, every vulnerability, every blind spot his captors had. During those long, freezing nights in captivity, Vlad came to a conclusion that would dictate every move he made for the rest of his life. He realized that in a world where giant empires swallow nations whole, a small kingdom doesn't survive by being nice. It doesn't survive through diplomacy, it survives by becoming so terrifying that even the biggest predator on the block thinks twice before taking a bite. You cannot afford to be prey. You couldn't just be a threat, you had to be a nightmare. You had to become something so unpredictable, so savage, that the giants would rather walk around you than step on you. Compassion in that brutal equation was just a fancy word for suicide. That citadel wasn't a school, it was a workshop for psychological warfare. Vlad witnessed interrogations, floggings, beheadings, all done with chilling robotic discipline. He studied the timing. How long do you leave the body up? Where do you place the head, so the maximum number of people see it? How do you make the image of suffering outlast the pain itself? The principle was dark but elegant. If you expose the mind to enough horror, it surrenders long before the body actually dies. It's mind control through trauma. Years ground on. When Vlad was finally released and sent back to Wallachia, the innocent boy who had been traded away was gone, dead and buried. In his place stood a man who had spent his most formative years in the belly of the beast. He didn't come out converted. He came out weaponized. His intellect was razor sharp, and any warmth he once had was buried under layers of calculated ice. He marched toward his homeland with one single conviction burned into his DNA. Wallachia would either become something the world feared, or it would cease to exist. But what was waiting for him wasn't a welcoming party. Wallachia was a mess, a bruised strip of land crushed between two superpowers, Catholic Hungary pushing from the north and the Ottoman machine grinding from the south. The economy was trash. Lawlessness was spreading like a virus. The poor were starving, while the local elites, the boyars, were getting fat on corruption. These nobles had turned treachery into an art form over generations. They had overthrown rulers, switched sides whenever the wind blew, and most unforgivably, they had orchestrated the assassination of Vlad's father and buried his older brother alive. This wasn't just politics for Vlad. This was vengeance fused with survival. He knew with absolute clarity that if he tried to play nice, if he tried to negotiate with this rotting system, the boyars would chew him up and spit him out just like they did everyone else. If he wanted a nation that could stand up to the Ottomans, he first had to purge the cancer growing inside his own house. His opening move was disguised as a celebration. Vlad summoned the nobility to a massive banquet at Targovishte, his royal seat. He rolled out the red carpet, exquisite food, expensive gifts, and rivers of spiced wine, lulling them into a false sense of security before the hammer dropped. He let them think they had won. He allowed them to feast, to drink, to puff out their chests and posture, fully convinced that this new prince was just another puppet they could manipulate. Right there in that hall, raising their cups in a toast to him, were the very men, the snakes, who had personally dipped their hands in the blood of his family. Not a single one of them had the slightest clue that the meal they were enjoying would be the last thing they ever tasted. It was the calm before the storm. When the final toast echoed off the walls and the torches began to flicker and fade, Vlad didn't just speak, he unleashed hell. The doors slammed shut, sealing their fate instantly. Armed soldiers flooded the hall like a tidal wave. The masquerade was over. Dozens of these high-ranking boyars were slaughtered right where they sat, their blood mixing with the wine. The rest were dragged away in chains, kicking and screaming, realizing too late that their time was up. But you have to understand, Vlad wasn't just interested in taking out a few bad apples at the top. His vision was far more radical. He intended to burn down the entire corrupt hierarchy, to annihilate the class structure that had kept Wallachia on its knees for generations. He was tearing it out by the root. The judgment fell on everyone. The wives and daughters of those executed nobles, women who had lived lives of pampered luxury. Never knowing a day of struggle or physical hardship, were stripped of their status and their silks. Bound like common criminals, they were marched straight toward the unforgiving mountains. Under the punishing heat of the sun and the brutal biting winds of the highlands, these women were forced to confront a nightmare. They were compelled to construct the fortress of Poenari with their own bare hands. Their fine garments turned to rags, disintegrating into filthy strips as the labor destroyed them. Hands that had never touched anything rougher than velvet, cracked open skin, splitting fingernails, torn away as they dragged heavy masonry up impossible slopes. Many of them collapsed and died right there in the dirt, never to rise again. But those who survived, they emerged as different creatures entirely. Vlad's statement was absolute. It didn't matter who your father was. No title, no bloodline, and no gender would shield a single soul from serving his vision. In his world, you were either a functioning, obedient piece of his new state, or you were raw material to be consumed in its construction. From that point forward, his domestic rule operated on a single terrifying principle: total obedience or total destruction. There was no grey area. Theft, laziness, dishonesty, nothing was treated as a minor infraction. It was all treason against the order he was building. The legends speak of a golden cup he left at a public fountain right in the town square, available for any traveler to use. And guess what? It sat there untouched for years. Why? Because every person in Wallachia understood exactly what the price was for stealing under Vlad's watch, and nobody dared to pay it. But his iron grip extended far beyond common criminals or corrupt nobles. He put a target on anyone he deemed to be failing their purpose in his society. That judgment fell on women he considered unproductive or defiant with the exact same crushing force it fell on anyone else. You have to get inside his head to understand this. To him, a human being wasn't a soul with divine rights. A human being was a role. And if that role went unfilled, the person filling it became waste. They became disposable. While he was hammering brutal order into his own territory, the pressure cooker to the south was ready to blow. The Ottoman Empire was breathing down his neck, demanding their annual tribute, their protection money. They wanted gold cattle grain, but they demanded something that cut far deeper into the soul of the nation. They wanted the Christian boys. Sons ripped screaming from their families to be brainwashed and reshaped into Janissary soldiers. Every child taken was a future erased, a son turned into a weapon aimed right back at his own people. Vlad understood this demonic system with a hatred that went way beyond politics. He had lived inside the belly of the beast. He had breathed that air. He despised it with a cold, patient fury that doesn't fade with time, it only gets sharper. In the year 1459, he made his final decision. No more tribute. No more bowing down. And he didn't send a polite diplomatic letter to convey this message. He chose a gesture so violent, so horrific, that it could never be misunderstood. When the Ottoman envoys arrived at his court and refused to remove their turbans, hiding behind religious tradition, Vlad decided to assist them. He ordered his soldiers to make sure those turbans stayed on forever. Iron nails were driven through the fabric, through the scalp, and deep into the bone beneath. The turbans and the skulls wearing them became permanently united in a gruesome display. This wasn't just a diplomatic incident or a mistake. It was an invitation to total annihilation, and he knew it. Vlad understood the geopolitics perfectly. No empire on earth could permit a minor vassal to mutilate its ambassadors and still remain credible on the world stage. He knew the Sultan would be forced to respond with overwhelming, earth-shattering violence. Vlad also knew the math. He could never face the Ottoman military machine in open combat. The numbers, the siege weapons, the infinite resources, every conventional advantage was stacked against him. So he committed himself entirely to the one battlefield, where he believed a small nation could actually defeat an empire, the battlefield of the mind. In the winter of 1461, he made a move the Ottomans never saw coming. Instead of huddling behind his walls and waiting for the invasion, he went on the offensive. He crossed the frozen Danube River and struck Ottoman territory first. This wasn't a campaign for land or glory. It was a strategic operation designed to dismantle courage itself. Settlement after settlement was reduced to piles of ash. Fields were destroyed. Livestock was butchered right where it stood. He was scorching the earth. Families, men, women, children were torn from their homes without any distinction. When he sent his report to the Hungarian king, he didn't sound like a madman. He listed his results with the cold, detached precision of a clerk filing an inventory report. He provided the exact figures: 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians put to death. And that didn't even include the ones who burned alive inside their own homes. For Vlad, these weren't atrocities. They were simply data points, evidence that he was doing whatever was necessary for the defense of Christendom. But beneath that cold arithmetic lay something far more unsettling, something spiritual and dark. He was refining methods of psychological warfare, the way an engineer tests prototypes, adjusting, measuring, improving his craft. You have to realize, in the warfare of that era, captured women were almost never killed in large numbers. They represented value. They were slaves, they were leverage, they were labor. There was an economic logic that usually protected them. Vlad took that logic and incinerated it entirely. He began collecting captives without any regard for age, sex, or status, and he subjected them all to identical, horrific fates. He wanted the Ottoman soldiers following his trail to discover not just fallen warriors, but obliterated families. He wanted them to encounter the complete and total destruction of civilian life, arranged deliberately for maximum psychological trauma. This is the moment he perfected the technique that would permanently attach itself to his name: impalement. The stake was not designed for a swift execution. It wasn't a mercy. It was engineered with sick precision to extend the agony for as long as the human body could physically sustain it. A tall wooden pole was carefully rounded at the tip and coated with oil. It was then forced into the victim through the lower body at a precise angle calculated to bypass the vital organs, traveling slowly upward through the torso. The victim was then hoisted vertical, and the base of the pole was planted deep in the earth, leaving gravity to do the work, pulling the body downward inch by excruciating inch. Death was not immediate. It arrived over hours, sometimes it took days. Beneath the open sky, with flies swarming the open wounds and carrion birds tearing at exposed flesh, with organs slowly displaced and internal bleeding, building without release, the victim became a living monument to suffering. Travelers passing beneath these forests of the dead could see faces still contorted in agony, eyes still open, mouths still frozen in a silent, eternal scream. It was brutality transformed into a public art installation, and Vlad deployed it with increasing sophistication. He paid particular attention to the mothers. Captured women with children were not quietly absorbed into the machinery of war or traded as property. They were raised on stakes in the most visible positions available. The message roared louder than any trumpet on the battlefield. He was saying, "I am not only destroying your armies, I am reaching into your homes. I am turning your wives, your daughters, your unborn futures into instruments of war." He understood the human psyche. He knew that for many soldiers marching under the Ottoman banner, the image of their own women subjected to this fate was more devastating than any wound they could suffer themselves. The air along the Danube thickened with the smell of char and decomposition. Vultures wheeled in massive columns above endless rows of the dead. Villages stood hollow and silent. Water sources ran foul with death. Those who managed to escape carried what they had witnessed into every corner of the empire, and the stories moved faster than any cavalry column could ride. That was precisely the point. Word of this campaign of absolute horror finally reached Constantinople, the crown jewel that Mehmed II had ripped from Byzantine hands barely a decade earlier. The Sultan, the man who had breached the legendary walls of the Second Rome, now fixed his attention on this insignificant principality that had dared to humiliate him so publicly. He had already proven he could drag artillery across continents, reduce massive fortifications to rubble, and drown ancient civilizations in blood. But Vlad had struck at something much more vulnerable than military infrastructure. He had attacked the empire's dignity in full view of every ally and rival watching. Mehmed mobilized everything he had. From every province of his vast domain, he summoned the janissaries, the mounted cavalry, the infantry divisions, the combat engineers, and the heavy artillery. History books and contemporary reports give us the raw numbers, and they are staggering. We are talking about estimates of 60,000, maybe upwards of 80,000 soldiers or more. It was a mobilization of biblical proportions, gathering on the horizon like a storm sent by the Almighty to wipe a civilization off the map. Make no mistake, what the Ottomans were planning was not some standard military retaliation or a simple border dispute. This was a calculated campaign of total erasure. The objective was to delete Vlad entirely from the pages of history and force Wallachia back into the chains of submission or grind the entire nation into dust and ashes. But Vlad saw the writing on the wall. He knew exactly what kind of beast was coming for him because he had been raised in the belly of that beast. He spent his childhood held hostage inside the Ottoman machine studying their playbook. He understood clearly that if he tried to meet this Leviathan in a standard battlefield formation, his kingdom would be annihilated in a single afternoon. So he flipped the script and prepared a completely different style of warfare, something asymmetrical and terrifying. He initiated a scorched earth policy that would make a modern prepper shudder. Vast acres of croplands were set ablaze, burning the food supply before the invaders could take a single grain. The wells, the very source of life, were contaminated with rotting animal carcasses and lethal poisons. Entire villages were evacuated, leaving behind nothing but empty shells and ghost towns. Now his own people suffered immensely under these orders, but Vlad had made the hard calculation that there was no other alternative. He decided that if his nation could not defeat the empire with steel and gunpowder, he would defeat them with desolation, starvation, and pure dread. As the spring of 1462 bled into the heat of summer, the Ottoman war machine began its relentless march northward. It was a vast river of steel and flesh, an unstoppable force flowing toward Wallachia, convinced of its own invincibility. The Ottoman advance scouts rode ahead arrogant and expecting the usual texture of frontier warfare. They were looking for probing skirmishes, maybe some minor fortifications to topple or the occasional ambush in a mountain pass. But what they walked into was something that defied all military logic. It was the atmosphere that hit them first, a wrongness in the silence like the air itself was cursed. They found fields reduced to black stubble and ash. They found dwellings standing silent without a single living soul inside. They found livestock rotting right where it had fallen, filling the air with the stench of decay. The deeper they pushed into this nightmare, the stranger the landscape became. There were no fleeing civilians to capture, no predictable resistance to fight. There was only the occasional body left in plain view like a grim mark of crude scaffolds erected at crossroads, and the persistent crawling sensation of being watched from the dark tree line. The dark rumors about Vlad that had once circulated in the tea houses and court stories that seemed like exaggerated propaganda or folklore began to feel less like tall tales and more like prophetic warnings of a coming judgment. Now, before we follow those riders to the absolute horror waiting for them at the end of that road, let me pause and say something real. If you have stuck with this story this far, you are not here by accident. You are seeking something deeper. You are the type of person who wants history told without the filters, without the mainstream shortcuts, and with every difficult, gritty truth left intact. That is exactly why we built our inner circle, The Lineage. This is way more than just a membership or a subscription. When you join this movement, you become part of the remnant. The small group of people who make deep dive investigations like this one possible. We are building a community of people who refuse to settle for the surface level narratives they feed the masses. Members get early access to new content and exclusive material that we can't show just anywhere, but more importantly, you help shape which buried stories we unearth next. If this is the kind of raw, unfiltered history you believe needs to survive, consider joining the lineage and standing shoulder to shoulder with the team behind Ancestral. Because beyond the scorched earth and the poisoned water supply, Vlad was engineering one final apocalyptic act. This was not going to be a skirmish. It wasn't even going to be a conventional massacre. He was preparing a spectacle so profoundly horrifying, so spiritually disturbing, that even Mehmed, the man who conquered Constantinople, would find himself physically unable to advance. And at the heart of that nightmare once again were the women. They were transformed into psychological weapons of war without ever holding a blade. What those Ottoman riders discovered when they finally reached the gates of the Wallachian capital was not a demolished city or a crumbling defense line. It was something that defied the categories of warfare entirely. They walked into a landscape where the horizon itself seemed to be populated by human figures suspended between heaven and earth. It was a forest constructed not from timber, but from the bodies of Vlad's enemies. The message he had carved into the earth for the most powerful empire on the planet was only just beginning to be understood by the stunned observers. The Ottoman scouts who first crested that ridge were not rookies. They were not inexperienced men. These were hardened veterans of the Sultan's campaigns. They had ridden through devastated provinces, they had witnessed the bloody aftermath of raids, and they had buried their own comrades taken by ambush. But nothing in their collective experience had equipped them for the abomination Vlad had constructed in the approaches to Targovishte. As the valley opened up before them, they did not see a defensive position or a ruined settlement. They saw an endless grid, a matrix of tall wooden poles, and on every single pole hung a human body. Later sources and historical records describe a field stretching nearly 3 kilometers in length and a full kilometer across. It wasn't a forest of trees, it was a literal forest of flesh, a monument to death on an industrial scale. Contemporary chroniclers place the number of victims at roughly 20,000. Let that sink in. This was not the scattered carnage left behind after a chaotic battle. This was organized. It was systematic. It was intentional. The highest-ranking captives had been mounted on the tallest stakes near the center, as though Vlad had imposed a grotesque hierarchy even upon the dead. Surrounding them in widening rows were the common soldiers, the farmers, the elderly men, the adolescent boys, and the women. You have to understand most military leaders of that century as savage and brutal as they were still observed certain unspoken boundaries when it came to female captives. Sure, they might be enslaved, violated, or bartered as commodities, but the mass public execution of women on this scale, that was virtually unknown. Vlad shattered that convention deliberately. He dragged the women to the very center of this display to send a message that the old rules were gone. Witnesses recall the haunting sight of long hair stirring in the breeze, garments stiff with filth and dried blood, and bare feet dangling motionless above the ground. Some of the bodies had already begun to rot and decompose in the sun. Others were recent enough that their final expressions of agony remained legible on their faces. But what shattered the observers most completely were the mothers. Some had been impaled within arm's reach of their own children. Others had their infants fixed to the very same stake, tiny forms lashed or pierced alongside the bodies that had carried them into this world. It was a complete perversion of the natural order. It is impossible at this distance in history to separate precise documentation from the inevitable distortion of horror and legend. But the pattern across every single account is consistent. Vlad had made the family unit itself part of the weapon. He wanted every Ottoman soldier staring at those women to see his own wife. He wanted him to see his own daughter, his own mother. Impalement, as Vlad practiced, it was not just improvised fury or blind rage, it was a technique refined for maximum duration and maximum visibility. The victim was positioned with surgical precision so that death would arrive as slowly as the human body could possibly sustain. The pole was angled to initially bypass the heart and the major arteries, prolonging the suffering. Once the body was hoisted upright and the base planted in the ground, gravity became the executioner, pulling the victim downward by fractions of an inch. Pain, extreme dehydration, and systemic shock completed the gruesome process. A single person could remain suspended and conscious for many hours, sometimes even longer, watching the living world move beneath them while they died by inches. By the time Mehmed II reached the field with the bulk of his forces on June 17, 1462, Most of those on the stakes had already died. But the enormity of the scene remained intact. The smell arrived first, a heavy cloud of putrefactional blood and human waste baking in the summer heat. Then the visuals struck them row upon row of poles. Clouds of insects buzzing in the air, dark birds descending to pull strings of tissue from exposed wounds. The atmosphere was saturated with death. There was no direction a man could turn his head without confronting it. Now remember, Mehmed was no stranger to atrocity. He was the man who shattered the defenses of Constantinople. He had sanctioned mass killings before. He had executed rivals within his own bloodline to secure his throne. And yet Ottoman and Italian chroniclers alike, many of them openly hostile to Vlad, converge on the same observation: the scene disturbed the Sultan visibly. One account describes the Sultan pulling his cloak across his face as he rode past the rows of the dead, physically unable to hold his gaze on what his enemy had engineered. He couldn't look at it. Different sources preserve different versions of what passed through his mind in that moment, but all of them orbit the same realization. How do you wage war against a man willing to do this? How do you break someone who has already abandoned every convention, every boundary of ordinary conduct, just to terrify you? It's psychological domination. In certain versions of the story, Mehmed is said to have acknowledged that a ruler capable of such acts possessed a value and a will that transcended any piece of territory. It was revulsion braided with an involuntary recognition of the demonic willpower behind it. The damage to the army ran deeper than just its commander's composure. The soldiers filling the Ottoman ranks were not religious extremists or men indifferent to human suffering. They were ordinary men with farms and families scattered across Anatolia and the Balkans. Looking at those impaled women and children, they did not process the scene as a foreign atrocity committed against strangers. They saw a reflection of their own worst nightmares. They didn't just see dead bodies, they saw a gruesome trailer for their own potential destruction, a terrifying preview of what could happen to their wives and children back home. That terror bled through the encampments like a highly contagious virus, infecting every rank. You had hardened men vomiting in the dirt from pure stress, while others lay wide awake all night staring at the dark, terrified to close their eyes. The unit cohesion that held the army together began to fracture under the weight of the psychological strain. Mehmed looked at the situation with the cold, hard pragmatism that had built his reputation as a conqueror. He realized his soldiers were running on fumes, completely drained from weeks of endless marching and dealing with relentless ghost-like guerrilla attacks. Their supply chains were snapping because Vlad had pulled a classic scorched earth move, burning his own fields and poisoning the water wells before the Ottomans could get anywhere near them. It was total resource denial. The field of the impaled had smashed into the army's morale like a heavy siege engine, but this one was aimed right at their minds instead of their fortress walls. This wasn't the type of warfare Mehmed was used to. He understood open battlefields and calculated sieges, not this psychological horror show. It was a grinding war of attrition against the human spirit itself, with no decisive knockout blow in sight. For what might have been the very first time in his legendary military career, the conqueror looked at the odds and gave the order to pull the plug and turn back. The command went out over the lines withdraw. The most terrifying and formidable military machine in the known world threw it in reverse and marched south, leaving Wallachia unconquered. Technically, Vlad hadn't defeated the Empire's forces in a standard fight. He hadn't wiped out a single Ottoman division in open head-to-head combat. But he had pulled off something that basically no military strategist of his era thought was even remotely possible. He had forced the Ottomans to run the numbers and conclude that the return on investment for fighting him on his home turf was way higher than they were willing to pay. That victory, however, came with a bill so steep it practically bankrupted the soul of the nation. Wallachia was left looking like a hollowed-out shell, completely gutted by the conflict. Its population had been chased out of their homes, scattered into the deep forests like hunted animals, or ground into dust by forced service. The land itself had been weaponized, turned into a trap, and the people were treated like expendable spare parts in a national defense strategy that valued the survival of the state above absolutely everything, including the lives of the people it was supposed to protect. Vlad had managed to keep his grip on the throne for another season, sure, but he did it by dragging his country and his own humanity across every moral red line imaginable. And the worst part was the movie wasn't over yet. The conflict was far from finished. Mehmed was smart enough to know that sending another massive army northward would just be hitting the replay button on the same nightmare, just on a different calendar year. So he reached into his bag of tricks for a more elegant, precise weapon, Vlad's own flesh and blood. Enter Radu, the younger brother who had grown up in the luxury of the Ottoman court. He had long since converted to Islam and woven himself tightly into the fabric of the Sultan's inner circle. The contrast was stark, where Vlad was blunt, brutal, and terrifying. Radu was polished, refined, and diplomatic. Where Vlad governed through sheer dread and intimidation, Radu knew how to sell a product. People were desperate to buy the promise of a boring, normal life. The Sultan bankrolled Radu with troops and pointed him toward Wallachia with a public relations campaign designed specifically for exhausted ears. The message was simple: I'm not bringing steaks, I'm bringing stability. Under my watch, the grocery stores reopen. You can plant your crops without fear. Your taxes will follow a predictable pattern, not random extortion. No more forests made of corpses, no more seeing your own prince burn down your village in the name of resistance. Meanwhile, Vlad doubled down on the only playbook he trusted. He kept torching his own settlements to starve out the enemy, hunting down anyone he even suspected of looking at him sideways. For a Wallachian mother trying to hide her kids in some backwater village, the mental math was absolutely unbearable. From the south, you had armies coming to snatch up her sons and daughters as conscripts for the war machine. From her own ruler's side, you had raids that could burn her house to cinders just to prove a point about national defense. Radu's camp started looking like a beacon of hope, a magnet for defectors. The boyars, the local nobles who had spent years sweating bullets under Vlad's terrifying gaze, finally saw an exit ramp. They started sending their families, wives, daughters, children over to Radu's protection as a down payment on their allegiance. For these women, the sudden reversal of fortune must have been mind-bending and disorienting beyond comprehension. Think about it. One season, Vlad has noble women hauling rocks up mountainsides, like pack mules until they drop. A few seasons later, their sisters and cousins are being welcomed by his own brother as honored VIPs, symbols of a gentler new order. The approach worked like a charm, systematically taking apart Vlad's power base. Village by village, estate by estate, his support just evaporated. The people had simply hit their limit. They were totally burnt out on living in a nation that was perpetually 5 minutes away from setting itself on fire. The very fear that Vlad had used to crush crime and enforce discipline was now blowing up in his face. If your own ruler is just as dangerous to you as the enemy at the gates, then any alternative, even one backed by Ottoman power, starts to look like sweet mercy. By the autumn of 1462, Vlad was basically a one-man show standing nearly alone. His core Praetorian Guard remained loyal to the bitter end. But the broader foundation you need to actually run a country had vanished into thin air. Radu, backed by Ottoman muscle, and the Wallachian nobles who flipped sides, pushed deeper into the heartland. Vlad pulled back into the brutal safety of the high mountains, retreating to the fortress at Poenari. Talk about irony. This was the same stronghold built by the bleeding hands of those noble women years before. The stage for his personal catastrophe couldn't have been more heavy with symbolism. Poenari was perched high up above the Arges River, a place you could only get to by climbing a steep, merciless staircase that felt like it went straight to the sky. Inside those walls, Vlad huddled with his last few die-hard followers and his family. His wife was there with him. Now history books argue about her exact name, but the story of her final moments has survived across centuries of local memory. As Radu's forces tightened, the noose fires on the valley floor lit up the night. The sounds of war drifted up, troops marching, structures crashing down, distant shouting filling the mountain air. Vlad's wife stood on the ramparts watching it all go down, and she understood with crystal clarity what getting caught would actually mean. She wasn't just some anonymous prisoner of war. She was the wife of the boogeyman, the spouse of the man half the region wanted dead. If she fell into enemy hands, she would become a living trophy, paraded, degraded, and likely destroyed in public to satisfy the mob's hunger for payback against her husband. Local tradition says she turned to the people beside her and dropped a final declaration. She basically said she would rather let the fish in the river eat her body than allow herself to become a sideshow spectacle for her enemies to mock. And with that, she stepped off the highest point of the fortress and plummeted toward the Arges River far below. Whether those were her exact words or if the story evolved through generations of retelling the site, is still named after her tragic end, known to this day as the River of the Princess. That same night, Vlad slipped out through a secret mountain tunnel, leaving behind the fortress and the woman who had stood closest to him. For all intents and purposes, his war for Wallachia was a wrap. He had forced a massive empire to back down once, but he couldn't keep his own nobility in line or even hold his own household together. He was now a fugitive prince with nothing left in his pocket but a scary reputation. He rode toward the Kingdom of Hungary, hoping to get help from King Matthias Corvinus, a Christian monarch, who had publicly hyped Vlad up as a champion against Ottoman expansion. Instead of a helping hand, he walked into cold, hard calculation. Matthias had his own diplomatic deals to cut his own reputation to manage before the royal courts of Western Europe. Openly backing a guy who was already notorious globally as a butcher carried political risks that outweighed any strategic benefit. So the supposed defender of Christendom was quietly thrown in handcuffs. But here's the thing, you can't just lock up a legendary figure like Vlad without giving the world a good justification. And this is where a different kind of warfare began. A war fought not with stakes and fire, but with ink and paper. Europe was going through a massive tech revolution. A recent invention, the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg, had begun to reshape how news traveled faster than ever before. For the first time in human history, pamphlets and cheap booklets could be mass-produced by the hundreds, then by the thousands. It was mass media born overnight. Allies of Matthias and enemies of Vlad jumped on this new technology with enthusiasm. They flooded the market with printed accounts complete with woodcut illustrations, basically the viral memes of the 15th century. These images showed Vlad chilling at a dinner table right in the middle of a forest of steaks, calmly dipping his bread in a bowl of blood while executioners were chopping people up all around him. The numbers were pumped up, scenes were totally fabricated, and gossip was mixed seamlessly with documented fact. The objective was transparent: take Vlad from being a ruthless politician and turn him into a monster that existed totally outside the boundaries of human behavior. The ultimate irony is that this smear campaign succeeded so thoroughly that it actually laid the foundation for the Dracula legend itself. They tried to destroy a man, but they accidentally created an immortal monster. Long before Hollywood screenwriters or Bram Stoker ever dreamed up a vampire count, the printing presses of German-speaking Europe were already churning out the original viral horror stories. We are talking about centuries ago, but the public appetite for fear was just as voracious then as it is now. Readers across the continent were devouring these sensationalized, blood-soaked tales of the Impaler Prince, treating them like the ultimate tabloid scandal of the Middle Ages. It was a simple formula: the more grotesque and violent the account, the faster it spread from town to town. It was the ancient version of clickbait: if it bleeds, it leads. But here is the thing about propaganda and smear campaigns: there is usually a kernel of terrifying truth buried under the hype. When you strip away the exaggeration, you find a consistent pattern of absolute brutality that suggests a genuine foundation in reality, especially regarding how Vlad handled the women within his own borders. Vlad wasn't just a ruler, he was the ultimate authoritarian control freak consumed by a dark obsession with order. He looked at his nation and saw a machine that needed to run with zero friction. In his mind, hard labor, strict discipline, and a rigid social hierarchy were the skeleton of a functional state. If you weren't part of the solution, you were a problem that needed to be surgically removed. And God helped the women who stepped out of line. When women deviated from the specific roles he had cast for them, he didn't show mercy. He could be just as ruthless and lethal within his own territory, dealing with his own subjects, as he was against any invading foreign army on the battlefield. The domestic front was just another war zone to him. There is this one story that keeps showing up in the historical records preserved across multiple sources. It doesn't happen on a battlefield. It starts with a simple peasant and a shirt. Vlad spots a man walking around wearing a ragged, poorly made tunic that looked like it was falling apart. He stops the man immediately and demands to know why he is walking around looking like a vagrant in his kingdom. The man shrugs and replies that his wife hadn't managed to sew him anything better. Now, in most royal courts, this might have provoked a laugh or a minor scolding, but Vlad interpreted it differently. He saw it as something far larger and more sinister. To him, this wasn't just a bad shirt. It was a woman neglecting her fundamental obligation to the state. It was a symptom of laziness, a sign of disorder and a rot that he was determined to burn out of his kingdom. He didn't just lecture the husband, he had the guards drag the wife out of her home and bring her before him. He looked her over with a cold, clinical eye. She was physically capable, she wasn't sick, and she had no infirmity. In his twisted judgment, there was absolutely no justification for her failure to perform her duty. The trial was over in seconds, and the punishment was immediate and extreme. Depending on which history book you read, the outcome varies, but it is always a nightmare. Some versions record that he ordered both her hands chopped off right there so she could never fail to work again. Others claim she was impaled, turned into a human billboard as a public warning. Regardless of which account is precise, the message was identical. Under the Impaler's rule, the distance between a domestic shortcoming, like bad sewing, and a death sentence had been reduced to absolutely nothing. It was a zero-tolerance policy taken to a psychotic level. Let me give you another example, preserved in an old Slavic manuscript. It describes a widow who was seen in public speaking and laughing just a few days after her husband was buried. For any normal observer, this could have been grief expressing itself through nervous energy, or maybe just a woman seeking the comfort of human contact to keep from falling apart. But Vlad didn't see a grieving human being. He perceived it as defiance. He declared that her conduct was an insult to the memory of her dead husband and a direct violation of the moral framework he was determined to enforce at the point of a spear. He sentenced her to death, but he chose a method that reflected his particular brand of sadistic creativity. It wasn't enough to just kill her. He had to make a point about her internal character. He ordered the executioner to cut her chest open. Why? Because he claimed he wanted to inspect whether a faithful heart actually existed within her, or if it was just the emptiness he had already judged her for. It was a literal autopsy of the soul while she was still part of this world. The execution was framed as an examination, a perverse attempt to demonstrate that her interior nature confirmed the verdict he had already passed on her exterior behavior. Even if we allow for the distortions introduced by his enemies who wrote these chronicles, the underlying pattern holds firm. Vlad regarded women not as individuals deserving protection or empathy, but as functional units within his system. If they labored, obeyed, and conformed to his rigid expectations, they were allowed to be invisible. If they did not, their bodies could be repurposed as instruction manuals for everyone else. Now, before we follow the final chapter of Vlad's life and trace how his memory was reshaped into a global myth, I want to point you towards something worth your attention. If stories like this pull you in real power, real blood, and real human beings crushed between the gears of history, then you deserve a physical connection to this world. Check the pinned comment below. You will find a link to what I believe is the definitive dark history volume for any serious collection. This is not some casual paperback you pick up at the airport. It is a dense, substantial book filled with the most ruthless figures, the bloodiest chapters, and the darkest conspiracies humanity has ever produced. It is the kind of book you can set on a table and feel the gravity of centuries resting in your hands. If you know someone who considers themselves a history expert and thinks nothing can surprise them anymore, hand them this. It will prove them wrong. Or keep it on your own nightstand as a nightly companion of terrible truths you open before the lights go out. Just be warned, it is not for the faint of heart. If this deep dive style of investigation is the kind of content that keeps you watching, you will want this within reach. Hit the link in the pinned comment and add it to your personal archive. Because we are not finished with Vlad, not yet. We have watched him terrorize an empire, we saw him lose his wife to the cliffs of Poenari, and we witnessed a prisoner transformed into a printed monster by his enemies. But the final act of his life, the manner in which his head was separated from his body and sent to a city he never ruled. And the way modern tourists now wander through castles searching for a vampire who never existed there. That part of the story still remains to be told. And running through all of it are the same unresolved questions that haunt this entire saga. What does history choose to remember? What does it choose to bury, and why do the women who suffered the absolute most under his reign still stand in the deepest shadows of his legend? Vlad's years in Hungarian custody were not spent chained in a stone pit like an animal. But make no mistake, the cage was real nonetheless. Inside the luxury castles and fortified residences of King Matthias Corvinus, He had a front row seat to a different machinery of power, this time operating from the western side of the chessboard. Matthias needed Vlad alive for a very specific reason. A dead warlord is useless but a living hostage. That has leverage. That is a bargaining chip. Across Europe, Matthias was selling himself to Rome and to every Christian court as the great bulwark against Ottoman expansion. He was raising funds and support by claiming to be the shield of Christendom, explaining why he had imprisoned one of the only rulers who had actually made the Sultan flinch required a narrative. It needed a justification that could be printed and distributed at scale. And that is exactly what appeared. In German market towns and Central European trading cities, small books and folded pamphlets began rolling off the new Gutenberg presses. They told stories of a Wallachian prince who feasted calmly at long banquet tables, while thousands of impaled victims surrounded him in every direction. Woodcut illustrations showed him eating with steady hands, as bodies hung from stakes in the background, with executioners severing limbs just paces away. It was the 15th century equivalent of a viral smear campaign. Every new edition sharpened his outline into something less than human. Figures were exaggerated, anecdotes were distorted, but the central thesis embedded itself permanently in the public mind. Vlad was not merely a harsh ruler anymore. He was a phenomenon that exceeded the normal vocabulary of cruelty. Political necessity and genuine memory tangled together into something inseparable. Survivors who had witnessed his methods firsthand provided the raw material, and then printers amplified, embellished, and repackaged those accounts to move more copies. It wasn't just history, it was business. The man who had spent his entire career wielding terror as a strategic instrument now found himself imprisoned inside a terror narrative he had no power to edit. He had become a printed demon before his physical life even reached its conclusion. And buried beneath all the outrage over his monstrousness, the actual faces of his victims, especially the women who had been worked to collapse, impaled in public view, or cut apart in the name of social order, receded into the background. The monster occupied center stage. The lives he destroyed became mere set dressing for the legend. Eventually, however, the political winds around Matthias shifted direction. The Ottoman threat never disappeared, and the courts of Western Europe realized they wanted capable men willing to confront it. Practical considerations intervened as well. Alliances needed strengthening, marriages needed arranging, and borders needed redrawing. Vlad was not abandoned to permanent confinement. He was too valuable for that. He was eventually released and bound through marriage to a woman connected to the Hungarian royal family. The strategy was unmistakable. They needed to rehabilitate him. They had to transform the savage of the pamphlets back into a usable Christian prince. Vlad did not return to power as the overwhelming force he had once been. He was older, scarred by defeat and years of enforced stillness. But he still possessed something that no other available candidate could offer. He had a name that made the Ottomans hesitate and made his own neighbors lose sleep at night. With Hungarian backing and regional allies, he mounted a final campaign to reclaim the Wallachian throne around 1476. For a brief window, the crown was his again. But the country he stepped back into was not the one he had left, and neither was the man wearing the crown. The world had moved on, the game had changed, and the Impaler was walking into a future that had no place for him. The Wallachia that welcomed him back was a shattered landscape bearing the deep, ugly scars of history layered on top of one another. We are talking about entire generations that had been raised in a chaotic world where peace was a myth, knowing nothing but the endless cycle of warfare, brutal raids, and a revolving door of rulers who never lasted long enough to build anything. The local nobility, the boyars, had turned survival into a dark art form, mastering the ability to calculate the odds like gamblers. They learned to read the shifting winds of power, the same way a seasoned farmer reads the coming weather, making sure they never committed their loyalty to anyone permanently, because in this game, loyalty was a death sentence. Families across the region had been torn apart, forced to surrender their young sons to the Ottoman janissary system to be raised as soldiers for the enemy. They watched their harvest fields turn to charcoal by scorched earth campaigns designed to starve invaders, and they lost their daughters to the horrors of slavery or forced marriages across hostile borders. In the past, Vlad had used absolute terror to hammer this broken society into rigid alignment, driving his will into the people like iron nails driven through thick planks. But now the entire structure was groaning and shifting under the weight of it all, no matter how much violent force he applied to keep it together. When we look for the truth about his final months, the historical record becomes fragmented and full of contradictions, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Some sources describe him launching renewed aggressive military operations against the entrenched Ottoman positions, fighting until the bitter end. Other records suggest he was fighting a civil war against local rivals who were desperate to unseat him before he could consolidate his power again. But what every single account shares is a pervasive sense of erosion. The terrifying fear that had once compelled absolute obedience from his people had finally exhausted its potency. There is a universal truth in leadership that Vlad learned too late when a ruler relies on extreme cruelty as his primary instrument. For too long, the population does not quietly love him or respect him. Instead, they quietly wait in the shadows for the very first viable opportunity to be rid of him forever. That fatal opportunity arrived without any warning. In late 1476, Vlad was killed either in open combat or in a sudden treacherous ambush near the contested borderlands between Wallachia and the territory monitored by the Ottomans. To this day, the precise location and the exact date remain subjects of intense scholarly disagreement and debate. Some later traditions claim he fell heroically during a chaotic engagement with Ottoman raiding parties that caught him off guard. However, other theories suggest a far more tragic end, proposing that his own soldiers struck him down in the confusion of the battle, mistaking their own prince for an enemy combatant in the heat of the moment. A few darker, more cynical accounts propose that the nobles, who had lived in fear of him for so long, finally turned their blades on him, deliberately seizing a moment of chaos to assassinate the tyrant. But what carries the greatest historical weight is the gruesome reality of what happened to his body afterward. Regardless of whoever actually delivered the killing blow, his enemies immediately recognized the massive strategic value of his head. According to multiple historical traditions, his head was severed from his corpse, thoroughly cleaned and packed in a jar of honey to prevent decomposition during the long transport. Let's be clear, this was not a gesture of care or respect for the fallen leader. The use of honey was strictly a practical preservative to keep the organic material from rotting over the long distance, ensuring the trophy arrived intact. The head was then carried all the way to Mehmed II in Constantinople. For the Sultan, this was far more than just a military trophy, it was personal closure. Years earlier, he had ridden past the forest of the Impaled and been physically unable to keep his eyes on the horrors Vlad had constructed. Now the face that had authored that living nightmare was delivered to him on a platter, stripped of everything, stripped of its voice, its will, its power, and its threat. Historical sources indicate that the head was mounted on a high stake and displayed at the city walls or in a prominent public location. It was put there so that every passerby could confirm with their own eyes that the impaler was truly finished and could hurt them no more. The man who had used stakes to broadcast messages of terror across an entire region ended his earthly existence as just one more severed head on a pole displayed in the capital of the very empire he had spent his entire lifetime opposing. In that single gruesome image, the circle completed itself with almost literary precision. But while the man was dead, the stories and legends surrounding Vlad were only beginning their centuries-long expansion into myth. In the territories closest to Wallachia, his memory settled into something complex that resisted simple categories. Some regarded him as a vicious tyrant whose reign had been a sustained nightmare, particularly for the vulnerable and the weak. Others, especially as the centuries passed, chose to emphasize the strong hand of the leader who had kept the roads safe from bandits and kept foreign armies at a distance through sheer force of will. Many people held both of these interpretations simultaneously without feeling any contradiction, viewing him as a monster who had also functioned as a necessary shield. But for the women who had lived under his absolute authority, the memory carried a different texture entirely. Imagine the noble woman forced to drag heavy-cut stone up the steep slopes to Panari Fortress under armed guard, watching the skin of her palms split and bleed until the rock itself was stained red with her blood. Picture the peasant wife who understood deep down that a poorly sewn garment on her husband's back could be interpreted as a sign of laziness and become her literal death warrant. Think of the widow condemned simply because her grief did not perform itself loudly enough for the state's liking, sentenced to be cut open so a tyrant could claim to inspect the loyalty of her heart. Their experiences were never reproduced in woodcut illustrations for the history books. Their suffering never became a best-selling pamphlet circulated across the printing houses of Europe. It remained a local trauma whispered within families or buried in deep silence until no one remained alive to whisper it at all. Historians working through the archives in later centuries unearthed documents that preserve some of these smaller, tragic episodes. In one account, Vlad's men encounter a woman begging in public, claiming her husband has died and left her completely destitute. Rather than offering her aid or charity, Vlad orders a background investigation and discovers she possesses a small unused inheritance. For this deception, he has her impaled without a second thought. In another terrifying case, a woman conceals a lover while her husband is away on business. When Vlad learns of the affair, the consequence is not social shame or divorce, it is brutal mutilation and execution. Again and again across these grim records, women surface as the primary targets of a ruler consumed by absolute control. In Vlad's own twisted framework, these punishments were not random outbursts of sadism. They were calculated components of a comprehensive system of order. Every person occupied a designated function in his machine, and every function carried specific, non-negotiable duties. A wife was required to clothe her husband properly, to mourn with appropriate gravity, and to avoid any conduct he classified as shameful. If she failed in these domestic tasks, he believed the entire architecture of social order was threatened. That fanatical conviction allowed him to reclassify a simple domestic shortcoming as a criminal offense against the state itself. And once that reclassification was accepted, there was no ceiling on the punishment that could be justified in the name of stability. This is where the terrifying connection between the massive killing fields and the private household becomes impossible to ignore. The same intellect that designed the mass impalement of 20,000 human beings also determined that a single woman's poor needlework or a widow's laughter could constitute matters of life and death. The extreme terror projected outward against the Ottomans was constructed on a foundation of smaller, constant terror, imposed internally, directed most often at those with the least capacity to resist or fight back. Centuries accumulated and rolled on. The Ottoman Empire expanded, contracted, and eventually dissolved into history. Borders were redrawn repeatedly, and new nations and rulers emerged from the wreckage of the old ones. But Vlad's legend adhered to the Carpathian landscape like a stubborn stain that no amount of time could dissolve. Foreign travelers copied older accounts and introduced fresh distortions of their own to spice up the story. Some reimagined him as a pure national champion and hero. Others cast him as a blood-drinking fiend, operating totally beyond the limits of humanity. Almost no one thought to ask what had actually happened to the ordinary people ground to dust between his brutal methods and the empire's ambitions. In the closing years of the 19th century, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker encountered the name Dracula and a handful of vague references to a savage Wallachian prince. He blended these fragments of history with regional vampire folklore and the machinery of his own dark imagination to create something new. From that literary fusion emerged the fictional Count Dracula, an immortal aristocrat entombed in a Transylvanian castle, sustaining himself on human blood, recoiling from sunlight and crucifixes and pursuing women he desired to possess for eternity. The historical Vlad III had absolutely no connection to coffins or nocturnal transformations. He died the way countless mortal rulers died, violently on a contested piece of ground, bleeding out into the mud. But his name had been permanently welded to the fantasy. Hollywood later seized Stoker's creation and industrialized it into a global icon, stripping away the real history for entertainment. We got black capes and ivory fangs, hypnotic gazes, and candlelit corridors and gothic castles, photographed through soft atmospheric filters to sell tickets. Tourists began arriving in Romania, not to understand Wallachia's centuries of survival between two empires, but to search for the real castle of Dracula. Most were directed to Bran Castle, a visually dramatic fortress perched on a cliff that was never Vlad's primary residence and may have had little or no meaningful connection to him during his actual lifetime. You walk into these pop-up shops in October, and what do you see? It is a marketplace of mockery. Shelves are stacked high with cheap plastic fangs made overseas, wine goblets decaled with fake drops of blood, and disposable polyester cloaks flying off the racks by the thousands. We have taken a spirit of murder and commodified it, selling darkness back to our children for $5.99. To the sleeping masses, this looks like innocent fun. They tell you it is just harmless entertainment to spice up the season. Americans love the adrenaline rush of a haunted house or a scary movie because it is contained within a safety box. They enjoy the theater of horror because they believe it carries no spiritual weight and no real-world consequences. But if you have the eyes to see, you know there is something far more sinister lurking beneath that plastic veneer. The Hollywood vampire you see on screens kills because of some romanticized curse or a scriptwriter's imagination. He is depicted as a tortured doll, a predator driven by a biological hunger or some misunderstood dark magic that makes him tragic rather than evil. However, the historical truth of Vlad the Impaler is not a movie script. It is a lesson in calculated terror. This man did not kill out of instinct, he killed as a form of violent communication. He treated human bodies like billboards arranging corpses to send a very specific, undeniable message to his enemies. And he wrote those messages in the blood and flesh of living, breathing human beings who were made in the image of God. We are not talking about mysterious, immortal brides from a gothic novel. We are talking about the desecration of the family unit. He targeted the backs, the chests, and the wombs of women mothers who held families together, daughters with futures ahead of them and wives who were loved. Think about the servants who woke up one morning to find their humanity had been revoked. They discovered they had been reclassified from people into raw material for a prince's political theater. This is the ultimate dehumanization, reducing a soul to a prop in a display of power. When tourists stand on those castle ramparts today, posing for selfies with novelty fangs and smiling for social media, they are standing on blood-soaked ground. They are walking over terrain where women were forced to haul heavy masonry until the skin literally tore from their hands. When they joke about sleeping in Dracula's chambers, they are treading through a region where villages once watched their wives and daughters marched away to be impaled or sold into slavery across borders. History itself is a cold judge. It does not resent this ignorance. History has no feelings, no tears, and no remorse about these events at all. But if truth and accuracy matter to us in 2026, those echoes of pain deserve to be acknowledged. The spirit of fear that Vlad embedded in the hearts of his enemies did not just dissolve when he took his last breath. For generations in parts of the Balkans, parents did not use his name as a joke. They invoked it the way other cultures speak of the boogeyman or a demon in the night: behave or he will come. That kind of deep-seated cultural persistence does not grow from a simple legend or a campfire story. It grows from traumatic events that scored themselves so deeply into the collective memory and the DNA of a people that even after the politics fade and the dates are forgotten, the visceral warning remains. The spirit of the age remembers that there was once a man willing to cross every line and go further into darkness than anyone else. And this brings us to the final, uncomfortable truth that we must face. Vlad did not invent the cruelty he practiced. He did not originate the act of impalement. The Ottoman Empire employed terror systematically as a tool of conquest. So did other Christian monarchs of his era, who claimed to fight for righteousness. Wallachia itself had endured violent rulers before him. But what set Vlad apart was the totality of his commitment to fear as his primary language and the demonic deliberateness with which he used women's bodies as the vocabulary within that language of terror. He looked at the categories of people traditionally considered protected under the laws of war and basic morality. He looked at wives, noble women, peasant mothers, and widows, and he saw not individuals to be spared, but instruments capable of shocking powerful men into absolute paralysis. He weaponized the innocent to break the will of the strong. That is why any honest conversation about Vlad in this era of awakening cannot stop at the simple binary question of hero or villain. The deeper, more spiritual question we need to ask is this: what happens to the soul of a civilization when terror becomes routine? What happens when those in power persuade themselves that cruelty is not a last desperate measure, but an efficient strategy for control? The physical bodies that once filled the fields outside Targovishte are long gone. The fortress of Poenari is nothing but a crumbling ruin today. The literal blood that stained the Danube washed downstream centuries ago. But the logic, the dark principality that permitted those acts, persists wherever authority treats human beings as instruments rather than ends in themselves. That spirit is still active in the world today. So the next time someone mentions Dracula and smiles about vampires haunting the Carpathian Mountains, I want you to remember this other version. I want you to see the reality behind the myth. Remember the boy who was surrendered as a hostage by his own father, betrayed by the man who should have protected him. Remember the man who converted his homeland into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Remember the ruler who sentenced women to death over garments, tears, and rumors. Remember the hardened Ottoman soldiers, men who had seen war, who saw their deepest fears materialized in the bodies of impaled mothers and were shaken to their core. And most importantly, remember the wives and daughters whose names were never recorded in the history books. Their final sight of this world was from the top of a wooden stake, looking down at a road they would never walk again. If you have stayed with this story to the very end, I want to thank you. You are the kind of person who refuses to look away when history turns brutal, and that level of awareness matters more than you know in these times. If you want more investigations like this, stories that dismantle the legends and expose the real decisions, the real bodies, and the real cost of power, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and press the like button. It signals to the algorithm that dark history and hard truths deserve a place on this platform amidst the distractions. Send this video to someone who still believes Dracula is nothing more than a romantic figure in a cape. Let them see what truly stands behind the mythology, and I want to hear from you in the comments section below. After everything you have heard today, who do you believe Vlad III truly was? Was he a desperate defender, driven to extremes by impossible circumstances, or was he a man who chose to open a door to something monstrous and let it consume him? This is the home of the best dark history analysis in the world, and we are nowhere near finished digging up the truth. Stay watchful.